So, constraints-led coaching. Uh, it sounds kind of intense. Like, are we talking about like restricting athletes or something?
That's a common misconception. It's not about being restrictive at all, actually.
Okay, so what is it then?
Well, it's more about setting the stage than directing the entire play.
Interesting.
It's about understanding how all these subtle environmental factors
hmm
can really end up influencing an athlete's skills.
Okay, so like not just what's happening on the field, but all the other stuff around it too.
Exactly, yeah. And it's rooted in this idea of ecological dynamics, which is basically
Ecological dynamics. Yeah.
it looks at the athlete as part of a whole system, not just like a single entity.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
Think about it like this. You've got a tennis player about to hit this drop shot,
Yeah.
right? And then you've got a rugby player sprinting down the field. Totally different sports, obviously.
Right.
But they're both actually, when you think about it, making these split-second decisions based on all these different factors, like where their opponent is, how tired they are, even like what the playing surface is like.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
And so constraints-led coaching really tries to recognize and utilize all these factors.
So instead of just isolating like specific skills, you're looking at how athletes learn and adapt in like a more dynamic setting.
Precisely. And that's where this idea of the coach as an ecological designer comes in.
An ecological designer.
Yeah, the article really emphasizes this shift. So, they're not just instructors anymore. They're kind of like architects of these learning experiences.
That's fascinating. How does a coach actually become this ecological designer, though?
Well, and that's one of the key questions this article is trying to address. It argues that coaches really need much clearer guidelines.
Guidelines like frameworks for how to actually implement this approach.
Exactly. Because it's not as simple as just, creating a chaotic practice environment and seeing what happens.
So what are some of the like specific challenges that coaches might run into with this?
Well, the article really dives into three major questions. The first one being, how do coaches address an athlete's errors in this kind of environment?
Because in a traditional setting, you'd probably just immediately correct the mistake,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But with constraints-led coaching, it gets a little more, I guess you could say, nuanced.
Can you give us an example of how this might actually play out in a, say, a real practice situation?
Sure. So the article uses the example of a field hockey player
Mm.
who, they're consistently dribbling with their eyes glued down at the
Instead of looking up.
right. Now, in a traditional coaching setting, you might immediately blow that whistle and correct them. But
Right.
a constraints-led approach asks, is this actually, detrimental? Or is it simply a variation in their technique?
Interesting.
Like, is it actually impacting their performance or how they're making decisions?
It kind of makes you wonder if, like, our instinct to correct every little error, maybe it actually stifles an athlete's natural development.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they're getting at. Are we actually limiting their ability to, like, solve problems on their own and adapt by always stepping in?
I see what you mean.
And so it becomes this balancing act.
Finding that balance between guidance and allowing those aha moments.
The self-discovery moments, absolutely.
So it's not just about like ignoring errors completely, but more about understanding their role in like the bigger picture of athlete development.
You got it. It's about creating an environment where athletes can, they can experiment, they can make those mistakes, but also learn from those experiences, all within a framework that's still structured and supportive.
Okay.
Which actually brings us to the second big question posed by the article, which is, so what happens when an athlete really gets good at something that works, in the short term, but might not be that effective or even could be like detrimental in the long run?
Okay, so not just a technical error then, but more like a flawed strategy that they've kind of gotten good at using.
Exactly, yeah. And it's funny because the article actually uses this example of a basketball player, and they've developed this habit of jump passing whenever they feel any pressure.
Okay.
So sometimes, yeah, they might get the ball past the defender, but a lot of times it ends up, throwing the timing off or even like putting them in a vulnerable position.
It's like that saying, practice makes permanent, not perfect.
Right. You can totally ingrain a bad habit just as easily as a good one.
Totally. And then it makes you wonder how much of that is happening even outside of sports, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
In just like all areas of life, right?
Like I can think of times when I've really honed a skill, but then looking back, it wasn't actually helping me in the long run, you know?
It's all about being able to recognize those patterns
Yeah.
and then be open to, you know, finding more effective ways of
Yeah.
doing things.
For sure. So then how does a constraints-led coach, how do they actually address that when they see these ingrained but maybe not so effective skills developing?
Well, if you're not directly correcting them, right, what's the alternative?
Right.
And that's where this idea of the coach as an ecological designer really becomes super important because remember, it's not about just letting athletes do whatever they want.
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
It's about being able to manipulate the environment in subtle ways to kind of guide their decision making.
Okay, so like in that basketball example, instead of just telling the player, hey, stop jump passing, you might, I don't know, change the rules of the drill or something.
Exactly. You might introduce a rule where if they jump pass, it's an automatic turnover, or maybe you've got defenders, but they're specifically trained to anticipate and intercept those passes.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you're not explicitly saying don't do it, but you're creating consequences within that practice environment that kind of encourage them to find a different solution.
It's almost like you're designing a puzzle for them to solve, and the solution is to find that more effective strategy.
I like that analogy, yeah,
Yeah.
because you're presenting challenges for sure, but you're also giving them the tools and the freedom within that environment to kind of figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
And this actually leads perfectly into the third really critical question that the article brings up, which is how much variability should coaches be building into these practice environments? Because if every practice is just, the same repetitive drills over and over, are you really creating that like dynamic, adaptable athlete that you want?
Yeah, that's a great point. It seems like finding that right level of variability is key, but how does a constraints-led approach look different from, say, like a more traditional coaching model in that regard? Yeah, because in traditional coaching, you've usually got that set schedule, right?
Yeah, very linear, like this week it's free throws. Next week we're on to dribbling drills.
Yeah.
Very structured,
Right.
but this constraints-led approach, it's got to be adaptable.
Okay.
It has to be responsive, to what the athlete needs right there in the moment.
So it's like you said, reading the room or reading the courts, the field, whatever it is.
Exactly, exactly. And then being ready to adjust.
So how do you actually do that, though? Like, how does that
Right.
actually play out?
Constant observation, constant assessment. Let's say, all right, you're coaching your kid's soccer team. You notice one of the players, they keep overhitting their passes, right?
Yep.
Traditional approach, probably isolate that skill, have them do passing drills over and over.
Right, right.
But with the constraints-led approach, you might think, okay, why are they doing that?
Look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. Are they overhitting because the teammate's way too far away? Are they rushing because there's a defender on them?
Oh, interesting.
Instead of just drilling the mechanics of the pass, you manipulate the environment.
I see.
So maybe you bring the players closer.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have a rule, only 2 touches allowed.
So they can't just wind up for that big kick.
Exactly. You create a situation where naturally they're going to start making those softer, more accurate passes.
So you're not throwing drills out entirely.
No.
It's more like using them as a starting point.
Through a framework.
Yeah, to build those micro challenges within practice.
Exactly. And this is where understanding how people learn, how we learn movement really comes into play.
Okay.
Because the research, it shows that practicing with variability, so where you're always facing these slightly different challenges,
Yeah.
that can be way more effective for developing those adaptable skills.
It's like you're never going to have the exact same situation twice in a real game.
Right. And that's what the article's saying.
Yeah,
This constraints-led approach, it kind of naturally builds that in, the variability.
makes sense.
But, and they acknowledge this too, there's still a lot of research to be done.
Like how much variability is the right amount?
Exactly. Yeah, how do you measure if it's working? They're
Right.
still figuring that stuff out.
So it feels like, I don't know, we're kind of on this edge of a whole new understanding of coaching, you know?
For sure, for sure.
We've got these great principles, but figuring out the best way to apply them, that's the next step.
It's exciting.
Right.
And it's interesting, this idea, right? Constraints-led learning. It's not just for sports.
Oh, really?
Think about learning an instrument. You've got the constraints of the instrument itself, the musical notes, all of that, right?
The rules.
But within that, there's so much room to be creative.
Oh, that's a good point.
Or even like cooking. You've got your ingredients, you've got your techniques.
You got to work with what you've got.
Yeah, and that's where the real skill comes in. Figuring out how to make something amazing within those boundaries.
So it's almost like we need to shift our thinking
Yeah.
because we see constraints as these limitations.
Mhm.
Right.
But they can be, like you said, opportunities to
Yeah.
grow, to solve problems in a new way.
Exact.
Constraints as catalysts. I love
I
that.
know, right?
This has been great. It really makes you think differently. Like, where else in life could we use a little bit of this?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's something to think about as you go about your day to day. Where's that line where maybe a little constraint could actually help you unlock something new?
Wow. Yeah. Food for thought for sure. This was great. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure. Always fun to chat about this stuff.